The conference room erupted in applause the moment Caleb Wren stepped through the glass doors. 50 people rose to their feet. Camera phones caught the light. Someone in the back row actually cheered. Caleb Wren, founder and CEO of Meridian Health Technologies, shook hands down the aisle with the practiced ease of a man who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. He smiled at the right moments. He held eye contact for exactly 3 seconds per person, long enough to feel personal, short enough to keep moving. By the time he reached the podium, the room believed, completely and without question, that he was the most confident man alive. He wasn't. The applause faded, the cameras lowered, and somewhere beneath the tailored charcoal suit and the rehearsed posture, Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his chest, that cold, quiet voice that never fully went away, no matter how large the room or how loud the crowd. You don't belong here, and one day everyone will know it. He delivered the keynote without a single stumble. Afterward, he took the private elevator to the 41st floor. The moment the doors sealed shut, he let out a breath that felt like it had been compressed for 6 hours. He loosened his tie. He pressed his back against the cold mirrored wall and stared at his own reflection. The man looking back at him was 39 years old. He ran a company that processed the medical records of 32 million Americans. 3 months ago, Forbes had called him the quiet architect of modern healthcare infrastructure. His assistant had framed the cover and put it on his office wall without asking. He hadn't had the heart to take it down. But tonight, like most nights, the penthouse apartment waiting for him at the top of this building felt less like a home and more like the inside of a very expensive jar. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon. He sat in the dark by the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. All that light, all those lives stacked on top of each other, and felt, as he always did at this hour, like the only person in the world who had somehow slipped through a crack in reality and landed somewhere he was never supposed to be. His phone lit up on the marble countertop, 12 unread messages, a calendar alert for a 6 a.m. call with the Singapore office, a text from his head of PR that said "Great optics today" with a thumbs-up emoji. He set the phone face down. He had been doing that more lately, the face-down thing, turning away from the noise. He couldn't explain it exactly. It wasn't depression, or at least he didn't think it was. It was more like static. Like every conversation, every meeting, every handshake was happening at a slight remove, as if he were watching himself from the other side of a window, performing the role of Caleb Wren while the real version sat somewhere quiet and slowly ran out of air. He opened his laptop, not to work. He'd done enough of that. He opened it because 3 weeks ago his company's behavioral health division had quietly launched a new pilot program, a confidential peer support line for healthcare workers struggling with burnout and isolation. His VP of clinical programs had sent him the link with a note. "Wanted you to see what we built. It's already helping people." Caleb had read that note 4 times. It's already helping people. He'd approved the program, signed the budget, attended the launch meeting. He had never once considered that he might be one of those people. He stared at the number on the screen for a long time. Then he picked up his phone, turned it face up, and dialed. It rang twice. "Hello." The voice on the other end was unhurried, warm in the way that a room with 1 lamp on is warm. Not bright, not performative, just present. "This is Tessa. I'm a counselor with the Meridian support line. I'm here and I'm listening. Whatever's on your mind tonight, we can start there." Caleb opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He hadn't expected that, the sudden, stupid difficulty of it. He was a man who spoke for a living. He had testified before a Senate subcommittee. He had delivered a eulogy at his mentor's funeral without breaking once. But sitting alone in the dark with a stranger's quiet voice filling the room, he found that every sentence he'd prepared dissolved before it reached his lips. "I don't really know how to do this," he finally said. "That's okay," Tessa said. "Most people don't the first time." He told her he was tired, not sleepy. Tired. The kind that sleep didn't fix. She didn't rush to solve it. She asked him a question instead, a small, specific one, the kind that didn't feel like a clinical intake form. And then she asked another, and somehow, without fully realizing the conversation had shifted, Caleb found himself talking about things he hadn't said out loud to another human being in years. He called back the next night, and the night after that. By the 3rd week, the calls had become the only part of his day that felt real. He didn't know what she looked like. She didn't know his last name. He'd given only his first, which was policy on anonymous support lines. She knew nothing about Meridian, nothing about the Forbes cover on his wall, nothing about the 32 million patient records, or the Singapore office, or the 12 unread messages. She only knew the version of him that existed at 11 p.m. in a dark apartment, bourbon in hand, too tired to perform. That version, it turned out, was considerably more honest. "I keep waiting for someone to pull back the curtain," he told her one night. He was sitting on the floor of his home gym, back against the wall, knees pulled up. He'd worn himself out on the rowing machine, and then just stayed there. "I've built something real. I know the numbers. I've seen the outcomes data. But there's this part of my brain that won't accept it. Like I'm the only one in the room who knows the whole thing is held together with luck and borrowed time." Tessa was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone searching for something reassuring to say. The quiet of someone actually thinking. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah. When did you first decide that the luck wasn't yours to keep?" He didn't answer right away. He stared at the rubber floor mat, at the faint chalk marks from a workout 3 days ago, and thought about a hospital in Indianapolis. He thought about his father, not the man his father became later, the recovered one, the proud one who kept the Forbes cover on his wall in Indiana, but the earlier version, the one who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep up, the one who'd sat in a plastic chair outside an emergency room and made Caleb, who was 11 years old, promise not to tell his mother how bad it had gotten. Caleb pressed the back of his head against the wall. "There was a night," he said slowly, "when I was a kid. My dad had a cardiac event, not massive but serious enough, and I remember sitting in the waiting room filling out a financial assistance form because we couldn't cover the copay. I was 11. I shouldn't have known what a copay was." He paused. "I built this whole company around the idea of making healthcare less." He stopped, swallowed. "Less like that waiting room. Less like a kid with a clipboard who doesn't understand why his dad might die because the number at the bottom of a form is too high." The silence on the other end was different from the ones before it, heavier, more careful. "Caleb," Tessa said softly, "that boy in the waiting room, he built something that means other kids won't have to sit where he sat. That's not luck, that's consequence." He didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had roughened in a way he couldn't entirely control. "I've never told anyone that story." "I know," she said. "I could tell." He called her after board meetings, when the adrenaline left and the apartment felt too large. He called her during a flight delay in Denver, talking low so the business class cabin couldn't hear. Once, memorably, he called from the parking garage of his own building at midnight because he couldn't make himself go upstairs and face the silence. She was always there. Her voice was always exactly what it had been the first night, unhurried, warm, present. He started to notice the edges of a feeling he couldn't quite name. Not dependency, it wasn't that. It was more like recognition. The sense that whoever Tessa was on the other end of these calls, she understood something about the specific texture of his loneliness that he had never successfully explained to anyone who could actually see his face. He asked her about herself, carefully, within the limits of what the protocol allowed. She deflected with a practiced ease that somehow didn't feel like deflection, more like genuine privacy, the kind that belonged to a person who had learned the hard way that full visibility was not always safety. "Do you ever get tired of listening to other people's worst hours?" he asked her once. A short pause. "No," she said, "but I think I used to be afraid of them." "What changed?" She was quiet for longer than usual. "I had a few worst hours of my own," she finally said. "It clarifies things." He wanted to ask more. He didn't. He was learning slowly to hold space for the things she wasn't ready to say, the way she had always held space for his. 4 months in, he asked if she'd meet him for coffee. The line went quiet, not the comfortable quiet, a different kind. "Caleb," her voice was careful, "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" Another pause. "Because I'm not." She stopped, started again. "The version of me you know exists in the dark, on a phone, at 11 o'clock at night. I'm not sure the daylight version would be what you're expecting." "I'm not expecting anything," he said. "I just want to sit across a table from someone I actually want to talk to. That's genuinely not something that happens very often in my life." She didn't say yes, she didn't say no, she said, "Give me some time." He respected that. He told himself he'd wait as long as it took. He meant it. 2 weeks later, Caleb was in a cab crossing the river at 7 a.m. after a red eye from a conference in Boston when his head of communications called. "Have you seen your email? I've been on a plane for 4 hours. Open it now." He opened it. The first thing he saw was a forwarded message from a board member, one of the older ones, cautious by nature, the kind who sent 3-sentence emails and never used punctuation. This one had 6 sentences and an attachment. The attachment was an audio file. It was 47 seconds long. It was his voice, unmistakably, from a call approximately 2 months ago, describing the Indianapolis hospital waiting room, the financial assistance form, the 11-year-old boy with the clipboard. The quality was clean. Not recorded on a phone, recorded at the source, through the line itself. His communications director was still talking. Words like board concern and psychological fitness and mandatory review scrolled past him while Chicago appeared through the cab window in the gray morning light. Caleb hung up. He sat very still. Outside, the city went about its business. A delivery truck double-parked. A woman walked a dog the color of burnt caramel. A traffic light changed from red to green. He thought about Tessa's voice, the warmth of it, the patience, the specific way she had said "I could tell," not as a therapeutic technique, but as the admission of someone who was genuinely paying attention. Then he thought about the recording, the clean audio quality, the precision of the clip. A cold surgical clarity descended on him. By the time he reached his building, he had already identified 3 possible entry points for a breach of the line's server infrastructure. By the time he reached his office, his head of information security was waiting. By noon, the technical picture was clear. Someone had accessed archived call data through a compromised administrative credential. It was not a passive breach. It was targeted and deliberate. He needed to know who. The answer took 72 hours and arrived on a Wednesday evening in a file his security team dropped on his desk. He read the name twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Von Aldrich. He knew the name. Everyone in healthcare technology knew the name. Von Aldrich had spent 12 years as a venture partner at one of the firms that had funded Meridian in its early stages. He had been quietly edged out of the board 4 years ago after a protracted dispute over the company's direction. Specifically over the decision to keep the platform nonprofit adjacent rather than pursue the pure monetization model Aldrich had pushed for relentlessly. He had left publicly gracious and privately furious. Caleb had considered it resolved. He had been wrong. But there was something else in the file. A second name, connected to Aldrich's current consulting firm, listed as a contracted researcher on a project that had begun, according to the billing records, approximately 2 weeks before Caleb's first call to the support line. The name was Teresa Vance. Tessa. The file said she was 36, former clinical social worker, had worked the Meridian support line as a contracted counselor for 5 months. Her employment application listed her previous employer as a nonprofit in Phoenix. What it did not list, what he found in a separate court document buried 3 clicks deep, was that her maiden name had been Aldrich. She was Von Aldrich's daughter-in-law, formerly, divorce finalized 8 months ago. Caleb read the file twice, then he set it on the desk, face down, and did not touch it for the rest of the day. That night he did not call. He sat by the window with no bourbon, no phone, no ambient noise. He sat with the shape of what he thought he knew and tried to find the place where warmth and calculation could exist in the same person simultaneously. He had met people like that. Not many. He had always been able to identify them eventually. The warmth that was performance had a specific temperature to it, slightly too steady, slightly too available, like a light that never flickered. Tessa's warmth had flickered, more than once. There had been nights when she'd gone quiet, in a way that wasn't professional distance. It was the quiet of someone managing their own pain while trying to be present for someone else's. He had noticed. He hadn't said anything because he hadn't wanted to make her feel observed. He thought about her saying, "I had a few worst hours of my own." He thought about it for a very long time. Then he thought about the 47-second audio file and the board member's 6-sentence email, and he got up and poured the bourbon after all. The emergency board review was scheduled for a Thursday. It was framed as a wellness check. "We simply want to ensure our leadership team has the support they need," but the language in the briefing document was precise in the way that legal language is precise when it has been specifically designed to provide cover for a predetermined outcome. Caleb had drafted enough of those documents himself to recognize the architecture. Von Aldrich was not on the board. He had not been on the board for 4 years, but he had spent those 4 years methodically rebuilding influence, through the consulting firm, through investments in 3 competing companies, through quiet dinners with the 2 board members most susceptible to persuasion. And now he had an audio file of the company's founder describing childhood trauma and professional self-doubt in a way that could be characterized, if you were the kind of person who characterized things that way, as evidence of psychological instability. The morning of the board review, Caleb arrived early and sat at the head of the long table alone, looking at the skyline. His attorney was in the adjacent room. His communications director was managing the press. His head of security had submitted a formal breach report to the relevant regulatory bodies, which would create significant legal exposure for whoever had commissioned the hack, but that process took time, and the board vote did not. The members filtered in. Von Aldrich was not present, but his fingerprints were everywhere, in the careful seating arrangement, in the printed agenda, in the way 2 board members avoided eye contact when Caleb looked at them directly. The meeting was called to order. The agenda moved to the item in question. Someone cleared their throat. Caleb's phone, which was face up on the table for the first time in recent memory, vibrated once. He glanced at it. It was a link, sent from an unknown number. The link went to the website of the Chicago Tribune. The article had been published 40 minutes ago. The headline was precise and without mercy. Von Aldrich faces federal complaint over unauthorized access to healthcare communications data. Below it, in the subheading, former Meridian board member accused of orchestrating targeted breach of confidential mental health support line. The article was detailed. It named Aldrich's consulting firm. It described the compromised credential. It quoted at length from a formal statement submitted to federal regulators by a whistleblower, a contracted counselor who had become aware of the breach when she discovered that archived call data she had not flagged for review had been accessed by a third party. She was identified in the article only as a former employee of the support line. She had submitted her resignation the same morning. She had also, the article noted, voluntarily provided regulators with documentation of a pressure campaign conducted against her, one that had involved explicit threats relating to her custody arrangement for her 7-year-old daughter, Nora. Caleb read the article once. Then he set his phone down, looked at the 2 board members who had been avoiding his eyes, and waited. The vote to proceed with the review failed. The meeting was adjourned in under 12 minutes. He found her resignation letter in his email when he got back to his office. It was 3 sentences long, professional, no explanation, no apology, no return address. She had listed her supervisor as the contact for any follow-up. He tried the support line number. It rang through to a different counselor. He called the nonprofit in Phoenix. The number had been disconnected. He went to his computer and did what he had promised himself 4 months ago on a freezing Tuesday night that he would never do. He used the access available to him as CEO of the company that had employed her, and he found her emergency contact record. He stared at it for a long time. Then he closed the file without writing anything down. He was not going to find her that way, not because he couldn't, but because of who she had been to him in the dark, at 11 o'clock, when he was sitting on the floor of his home gym with chalk-marked hands and nothing left to perform. She had never used anything against him. He owed her the same. He was almost to the elevator when his assistant stopped him. "There's a package at the front desk, dropped off this morning. No sender name." It was a small cardboard box, the kind things get shipped in when someone is in the process of moving. Inside, wrapped in a single sheet of paper, was an object he recognized immediately, a telephone headset. Older model, the kind that plugged into a desk phone, the kind that counselors on the support line had used before the system was upgraded 6 weeks ago. Beneath it was a folded note, handwritten. "I know you read the file. I know you found the Aldrich connection. You must have, because you're thorough, and you are. I always knew you were. even when you were pretending you weren't sure of yourself. I want you to know that I took the job because I needed income after the divorce. Vaughn made my life very small for a very long time, and when it finally ended, I was starting from zero with a daughter who needed stability and a profession I had almost given up on. The Meridian line was legitimate work. It was real. Then your calls started, and within 2 weeks I knew who you were, not because Vaughn had anything to do with it. I hadn't spoken to him in 8 months. I knew because you mentioned the healthcare reform panel in D.C. in passing, and I remembered the name from a conference I'd attended the year before, and I thought, that's the same person, and I almost ended it right there. I should have. I know I should have. But here is the thing about sitting in the dark night after night and listening to someone dismantle themselves honestly, without agenda, without audience. You start to understand what that costs. And somewhere around the 4th week, I stopped hearing Nolan Reed's Founder, or the Forbes Profile, or the 41st Floor. I was just listening to Caleb, and Caleb was someone I couldn't bring myself to let go of. When Vaughn came to my apartment, and yes, he found me, he has always been very good at finding people who are trying to disappear. He told me what he wanted. He told me what would happen to Nora if I didn't cooperate. I spent a night I won't describe sitting in front of a keyboard, and in the morning I decided that I would rather lose every legal battle he could mount against me than destroy the one person who had made me feel like existing again. I didn't give him anything. I never recorded a single call. Whatever he obtained by other means. The statement I gave to regulators was the truth, all of it. I am not asking you to trust me. I'm not sure I've earned that. I'm asking you to take care of yourself with the same honesty you brought to those late-night calls, and to know that someone who never met you properly is grateful, every single day, for the version of you that picked up the phone. T. P.S. Nora says hi. She doesn't know who you are, but last week she told me that I seem less sad lately, and I thought you should know. Caleb sat in the lobby of his own building and read the letter twice. The second time, he had to stop twice to collect himself. He thought about a waiting room in Indianapolis. He thought about the specific weight of a clipboard in an 11-year-old's hands. He thought about the voice on the other end of the line saying that's consequence, not luck, and the way it had loosened something in his chest that he had been holding rigid for almost 30 years. He thought about Nora, who was 7 years old and had told her mother she seemed less sad lately. He folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his ribs, and sat for a while, with the headset on the seat beside him. Then he went back to the desk and asked if the delivery person had said anything about a return address. The receptionist shook her head, but she called a cab from out front. I heard her tell the driver, Lakeview area, I think, near the park. Caleb walked out into the Chicago afternoon. The lake was 4 blocks east. The park that ran along it stretched for miles. It was a Wednesday in late October, the sky the particular flat gray of a city preparing for winter, and the trees had gone mostly bare. He found her 40 minutes later. She was sitting on a bench near the water with a small girl beside her, the two of them sharing what appeared to be a bag of pretzels and watching the lake. The woman was wearing a dark green coat that was slightly too thin for the temperature and had her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had not spent time in front of a mirror this morning. She was not looking at her phone. She was watching the water with the quiet attention of someone who had recently remembered that the world contained things worth looking at. Caleb stopped on the path about 20 feet away. The little girl noticed him first. She looked up, curious and unguarded in the way that children are when they haven't yet learned to be careful about strangers. The woman followed her daughter's gaze. When she saw him, she went very still. He walked over slowly and sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving space between them. The lake moved. A pair of geese crossed the gray water without hurry. I didn't use the file, he said. I want you to know that. I found it and I closed it. Tessa looked at him for a long moment. Up close, she had the specific quality of a person who had recently come through something difficult and was still in the process of determining whether the ground was solid. Her eyes were watchful and careful and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I know, she said, that's why I sent the note. The little girl looked between the two adults with the calm, unsentimental curiosity of a child who has learned that adult conversations sometimes require patience. She held out the bag of pretzels toward Caleb. He took one. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," Nora said, entirely matter-of-fact, and went back to watching the geese. Caleb looked at the water. He thought about what to say and decided that the most honest thing was probably also the simplest. "I don't know what comes next," he said. "I'm not great at not knowing what comes next." "No," Tessa said, "I gathered that. But I'd like to find out." He paused. "If that's something you'd consider, at something like a reasonable pace, no pressure, no agenda." She was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the lake, cold and direct, and she pulled her coat a little tighter. Then she looked at him sideways, a careful look, but not a closed one. "I have a 7-year-old, she said. "My custody situation is actively complicated. I'm rebuilding a career and a life simultaneously, and I'm not particularly good at being taken care of." "Neither am I," Caleb said. "That's not a selling point." "It might be," he said, "if you think about it." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the shadow of a thing that was considering whether it was safe to appear. Nora looked up from the pretzels with sudden focus. "Do you work with my mom?" Caleb glanced at Tessa. She was watching him with a curious calm, not rescuing him. "Not anymore," he said. "Oh," Nora considered this. "Do you like geese?" "I don't have a strong opinion about them," Caleb said honestly. Nora nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned her attention to the water. "They're mean," she confided, "but they're also brave. That one," she pointed at a large, self-important goose in the middle of the group. "He went up to a dog earlier and just stared at it until the dog left." "That does sound brave," Caleb said. "Or stupid," Tessa said quietly, but when he looked at her, she was smiling. The three of them sat there as the afternoon light faded over the lake, the cold coming in steadily off the water, the geese carrying on with their business as if watched by no one in particular. There was nothing resolved. There were custody hearings and regulatory filings and a company that needed its founder to show up whole on Monday morning. There was a child who needed stability and a woman who needed time, and a man who had spent 4 months talking honestly in the dark and was only just learning what it meant to do the same in daylight. But right now, on a bench in October with pretzels and geese and the lake going gray at the edges, Caleb felt something he could not have described to the Forbes interviewer or the board of directors or the 500 people who had applauded when he walked into that conference room. He felt like exactly the right person, in exactly the right place. Not despite everything, because of it. I keep thinking about the moment Caleb sat in that lobby. Not the boardroom, not the penthouse, not the stage with the camera flashes, just a man on a bench in his own building's lobby, holding a cardboard box with a used headset inside it, reading a handwritten letter from a woman he had never actually met. That image stays with me, because everything that led to that moment was a consequence of something, not luck, not coincidence, consequence. Caleb spent years building armor out of competence. The more he achieved, the more convinced he became that the achievement was borrowed, that one honest conversation would expose him as the 11-year-old boy in the waiting room who didn't understand why goodness and hard work weren't enough to keep his father alive. So he got quiet in exactly the wrong ways. He performed openness in boardrooms and press interviews and kept the real thing locked somewhere he couldn't easily find it. That kind of silence has a cost. It compounds, and eventually it finds a way out. In this case, through a phone call at 11 o'clock at night to a stranger on a support line. What I find remarkable about Tessa is not that she helped him. It's that she did it honestly, even when honesty made her situation more dangerous. She knew who he was. She could have used that. She could have protected herself in a dozen small, justifiable ways that would have added up to a betrayal. She didn't. She made a choice, quietly and without audience, to be the kind of person she wanted to be. And she made that choice again when Vaughn came to her apartment with his threats and his USB drive, and his certainty that she would fold. The integrity she showed in that moment wasn't a grand gesture. It was just her character, doing what it had always done when it was tested. That's the part that gets me. We talk about courage like it's dramatic, like it announces itself. But Tessa's courage was the kind that happens at a keyboard, at 2 in the morning when no one is watching, and everything you've worked for is sitting on one side of a scale, and a 7-year-old girl named Nora is sitting on the other. She chose correctly, not because she was certain it would work out, because she couldn't live with the alternative. And Nora, I think about Nora telling her mother she seemed less sad lately. A child doesn't have language for what she's observing. She just knows that something in the house has shifted, that the air is different, that the person she depends on most is a little more present. Kids notice that before adults do. They always do. There's something in this story about what it actually takes to get better. Not smarter, better. Caleb didn't fix his imposter syndrome by achieving more. He fixed it by saying the thing out loud to someone who wasn't going to trade it for something. He had to be willing to be known, which is a different skill than being impressive, and considerably harder to develop. It required a kind of intellectual honesty most people spend their whole lives avoiding, the willingness to say, I don't actually know if I deserve this, and then sit with the discomfort of that until the answer comes. What stayed with him, what stays with me, is that the answer didn't come from outside. It came from the same place it always does, from choosing, over and over, to act like the person you're trying to become. Caleb built a foundation. He kept showing up. He held his word even when no one was holding him to it. That's not a philosophy. That's just a practice. And if you do it long enough, one day you look up and notice that the waiting room in Indianapolis is part of this story. But it isn't the whole story anymore. He earned the bench by the lake, so did she.